The spotlight hit Frank Sinatra like a blade of white heat as he walked onto the stage at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. It was October 15th, 1964, and the Copa Room was packed with 5,000 people who had paid good money to hear the voice. Hollywood executives, high rollers, society wives dripping in diamonds, all of them expecting magic. Frank adjusted his bow tie and stepped up to the microphone. The orchestra behind him held their instruments ready, waiting for his signal. The crowd fell silent, that particular hush that comes when people know they're about to witness something special. He opened his mouth to sing the opening line of "Fly Me to the Moon." Nothing came out, not even a whisper. Frank touched his throat, confusion flickering across his face. He tried again, his lips forming the words, but his vocal cords produced nothing but air. The silence stretched across the room like a tightrope, 5,000 people leaning forward in their seats, unsure if this was part of the show. Behind the spotlight's glare, Frank's vision began to blur. His chest tightened, and he could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. This wasn't just losing his voice. This was his worst nightmare coming true in front of the biggest crowd of his Vegas residency. The panic hit him like a freight train. His hands began to shake, and he gripped the microphone stand to steady himself. 49 years old, at the peak of his career, and his voice, the thing that had lifted him out of Hoboken, that had made him the chairman of the board, had simply vanished. The orchestra leader looked at him questioningly. Should they start the song anyway? Should they stop? Frank shook his head slightly, his mouth still moving soundlessly like a fish out of water. Then something extraordinary happened. From somewhere in the middle of the room, a gravelly voice began to sing, "Fly me to the moon, let me play among the stars." Every head in the Copa Room turned toward the sound. An elderly man in a simple gray suit had stood up from his table. He wasn't a performer. You could tell from his slightly off-key delivery and the way he clutched the back of his chair for support. But he was singing Frank's song with all the heart he could muster. "Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars." The man's wife tugged at his sleeve, embarrassed, but he kept singing. And then, miracle of miracles, another voice joined in. A woman at a nearby table began harmonizing, her voice sweet and clear. Then, another voice, and another. Frank stood frozen at the microphone, watching in amazement as his audience transformed into his choir. Business executives loosened their ties and sang along. Elderly couples held hands and swayed to the melody. Young lovers looked into each other's eyes and crooned the romantic lyrics. The orchestra, taking their cue from the crowd, began to play softly behind the impromptu chorus. The entire Copa Room had become something Frank had never experienced before. Not a performance, but a communion. Tears began streaming down Frank's face as he realized what was happening. These people hadn't come just to hear him sing. They had come to be part of something larger than themselves. The songs he had spent decades perfecting belonged to them now, lived inside them, had become part of their own stories. As the crowd sang, Frank began to move. Without his voice, he discovered he could tell the story of the song in other ways. He spread his arms wide on, "In other words, hold my hand," and every person in that room felt embraced. He pointed to his heart and, "In other words, I love you," and the gesture carried more weight than his voice ever had. The elderly man who had started it all caught Frank's eye and nodded, as if to say, "You don't need to carry this alone." When the song ended, the applause was unlike anything Frank had ever heard. It wasn't the usual Vegas showbiz enthusiasm. It was something deeper, more grateful. These people had just participated in their own healing, their own moment of pure connection. Frank stepped back to the microphone. Still no voice, but somehow that didn't matter anymore. He gestured to the orchestra, and they began the opening notes of "The Way You Look Tonight." This time, the crowd didn't wait for someone else to start. They launched into the song immediately. 5,000 voices blending in, imperfect but beautiful harmony. Frank conducted them like a choir director, his movements telling the story his voice couldn't. During the bridge, and that laugh that wrinkles your nose, he laughed silently himself, and the entire room seemed to understand that some emotions are too big for sound. They sang for him, with him, around him, creating a cocoon of melody that held them all. For the next hour, Frank Sinatra gave the most extraordinary performance of his career without singing a single note. He told stories with his hands, conveyed heartbreak with the tilt of his head, shared joy through the curve of his smile. The audience sang every song he indicated, from My Way to New York, New York, their voices growing stronger and more confident with each tune. During Strangers in the Night, something magical happened. Frank began mouthing the words in perfect sync with the crowd singing, and suddenly it looked like he was the source of all those voices. The visual effect was stunning, as if Frank's silent performance was somehow generating the sound that filled the room. A young woman in the front row began to cry during That's Life, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she was part of something unprecedented. She was singing Frank Sinatra's songs with Frank Sinatra, and her voice mattered just as much as his had on all those records. As the evening drew toward its end, Frank held up his hand for silence. The room quieted instantly, all eyes on him. He placed his hand over his heart and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Then he pointed to each section of the audience and mouthed, "Thank you" again, making it clear that the gratitude was flowing both ways. The orchestra began the opening notes of My Way, Frank's signature song. But instead of the crowd singing immediately, they waited. They seemed to understand that this moment belonged to Frank alone, voice or no voice. Frank stood at the microphone, his mouth forming every word of the song he had made famous. And somehow, watching him perform it silently made it more powerful than it had ever been. Every gesture became meaningful. The defiant tilt of his chin on I did it my way. The vulnerable moment when he touched his chest on, and now the end is near. As he reached the final chorus, the crowd couldn't help themselves. They joined in softly, not overpowering the moment, but supporting it. Frank's silent performance and their gentle voices created something that transcended entertainment and became art. When it ended, the standing ovation lasted for 10 full minutes. Frank bowed deeply, his hand still pressed to his heart. As he walked off stage, the elderly man who had started it all called out, "Thank you for showing us that music isn't about the voice, it's about the soul." Backstage, Frank collapsed into a chair, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. The Copa room's walls were thick, but he could still hear the murmur of voices outside, people reluctant to leave, as if they needed time to process what they had just experienced. His doctor, Dr. Morrison, was waiting with warm tea and concerned eyes. "Frank, when did you first notice the hoarseness?" 3 days ago, Frank admitted, his whisper barely audible. "But I thought it would pass. I've been pushing too hard. The recording sessions, the late nights, He trailed off, thinking about the pressures that had been building for months. Dr. Morrison examined his throat with practiced efficiency. "Severe laryngitis brought on by exhaustion and stress. Your vocal cords are completely inflamed. You need complete voice rest for at least a week." A week! Frank closed his eyes, thinking about the shows he'd have to cancel, the disappointed fans, the financial losses. But then he remembered the elderly man's face, the way the entire room had transformed into something sacred. "Doc," Frank whispered, "what if I told you that tonight was the best performance of my career?" Dr. Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Frank, you didn't sing a note." "Exactly." As the doctor left, Frank sat alone with his thoughts. Through the dressing room door, he could hear his pianist, Bill Miller, talking to someone in the hallway. The voice was familiar. It was the elderly man who had started the singing. Frank opened the door quietly and listened. "I served in World War II, the man was saying to Bill. "I was at Normandy, saw things no man should see. When I came home, I couldn't talk to my wife about it, couldn't explain what it was like over there. But I had Frank's records. I'll never smile again, The Way You Look Tonight. Those songs helped me remember what I was fighting for." Frank felt his throat tighten, not from the laryngitis, but from emotion. The man continued, "Tonight, when I saw him up there struggling, I thought about all the times his voice carried me through the dark days. It was my turn to carry him." Frank stepped into the hallway. The elderly man, he introduced himself as Harold Peterson from Milwaukee, looked startled to see him. "Mr. Peterson," Frank whispered, extending his hand. "Thank you. Doesn't seem like enough." Harold's eyes filled with tears. "You gave me my life back after the war, Frank. Tonight I just returned the favor." They stood there for a moment, two men from different generations connected by the mysterious power of music to heal and transform. Over the next few days, as Frank rested his voice, something unprecedented happened. News of the silent concert spread throughout Vegas and beyond. The story was picked up by newspapers, then television, then magazines. But more than just media attention, something deeper was stirring. People who had been at the Copa Room that night began calling radio stations, sharing their own stories. The young woman who had cried during That's Life revealed that she had been contemplating suicide before that evening, but singing with 5,000 strangers had reminded her that she wasn't alone. A businessman admitted that he had sung louder than he had in 30 years, and it had released grief he'd been carrying since his father's death. Frank received hundreds of letters at the Sands. People wrote about their own moments of silence, their own struggles with feeling voiceless in the world. A teacher from Ohio wrote that she had started incorporating silent storytelling into her classroom after reading about the concert. A therapist in New York began using the story with patients who felt they had lost their ability to communicate. But perhaps the most moving letter came from a young singer named Maria Gonzalez, performing in small clubs in Los Angeles. Dear Mr. Sinatra, I wasn't at your concert, but I've heard about what happened. I wanted you to know that your silent night gave me courage to sing again. I lost my voice last year, not physically, but emotionally. Stage fright had stolen my ability to perform. Reading about how you found a way to connect with people without sound reminded me that the music lives in here. She had drawn an arrow pointing to where her heart would be. Not just here, another arrow pointing to her throat. Because of your example, I sang again last night. My voice cracked, my hands shook, but I sang. And the small crowd at the cafe sang with me, just like your audience sang with you. Thank you for showing us that sometimes our greatest strength comes from admitting our greatest weakness. When Frank's voice returned a week later, his first performance was at a small jazz club in downtown Vegas, not the glittering Copa Room. He had specifically requested an intimate venue, wanting to test something new he had learned about the relationship between performer and audience. The club held only 200 people, and Frank began the evening with something he had never done before. He talked about the night he lost his voice. I learned something last week, he said, his voice still slightly hoarse, but gaining strength with each word. I learned that the space between the performer and the audience isn't a divide, it's a bridge. And sometimes the most beautiful music happens when we cross that bridge together. He sang, "Fly Me to the Moon," but halfway through he stepped away from the microphone and gestured for the audience to join in. The sound that filled the small club was different from the Copa Room, more intimate, more conversational, but equally magical. After the show, a young journalist approached Frank. Mr. Sinatra, some critics are saying that what happened at the Copa Room was just a gimmick, a way to save face when your voice failed. How do you respond to that? Frank was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Harold Peterson, about Maria Gonzalez, about the hundreds of letters from people who had been touched by the story of that silent night. Son, Frank said finally, the critics weren't in that room. They didn't see what I saw. 5,000 people discovering that they had voices they never knew they possessed. They didn't feel what I felt, the realization that all these years I thought I was giving my audience something, when really they were giving me everything. He paused, looking out at the small club where people were still lingering, reluctant to let the evening end. Sometimes the most important lessons come wrapped in our worst fears. I was terrified of losing my voice, and when it happened, I discovered that I had been looking at everything backwards. The voice isn't what makes the music, the heart is. And that night, there were 5,000 hearts making music together. 3 days later, when his voice returned, Frank's first performance was different. He sang beautifully, but he also left spaces, moments where he would step back and let the audience participate, remembering the night when they had saved him by saving themselves. Years later, musicians would study what happened that October night in Vegas, trying to understand how a performer's greatest weakness became his greatest strength. But the answer was simpler than they realized. Sometimes the most important thing an artist can do is show their audience that the magic was inside them all along.